Hi there. My name's Richard Griffiths, and I'm director of the new Silk Roads project at the International Institute for Asian Studies here in Leiden. I finished writing my book on the Maritime Silk Road in the early months of this year, months in which we were all enveloped by events, the magnitude of which few of us could have envisaged at the time. Events which all had an immediate impact on the development of the seaborne trading networks that carry 80 to 90% of international trade. Recording this at the beginning of April, the implications are still unclear. Let's begin by looking at how it all started and the speed at which it engulfed us all. It was in December last year that doctors in Wuhan, a city of 11 million inhabitants in central China, first noticed a cluster of unusual pneumonia cases. On January the 7th, the sickness was identified as being caused by a new strain of the coronavirus. As the cases began to mount, the authorities decided on the 23rd of January to isolate the citizens of Hubei province, in which Wuhan was located. Unfortunately, the traditional Spring Festival, which always triggers a mass migration from the cities as workers return home to celebrate the holiday, started that very weekend. From that epicenter, the virus spread throughout the land, and with it came massive restrictions of work and freedom of movement, seen as somehow authoritarian at the time, but commonplace nowadays. On the 25th of January, China registered 1,000 cases. 7 days later, the number had passed 10,000, and 12 days after that, the 50,000 level was passed. From China, the virus spread to neighboring Korea, where the South registered its first 1,000th case on February the 26th. It too responded by restricting movements and closing down parts of the economy. In the course of February, Japan closed its schools and staggered working hours in a bid to stem the virus on an economy that was already faltering. It recorded its first 1,000th case only on March the 22nd, but that's partly due to a lack of testing. Now, the recorded number of cases is usually the recorded number of positive results of the test, and this is obviously not the same thing. Differences between countries in the numbers may equally measure the differences in the intensity of testing. However, they do serve as a lead indicator of the disease. Hospital admissions for serious cases follow after a delay of 2 to 3 weeks, and the deaths come 2 weeks after that. So it was that throughout the first 2 months of the year, Europe and America viewed the spread of the virus as some sort of Asian phenomenon. Avoid contact with those countries, and the problem was solved. Once the main economies Asia had dampened the crisis, they would rebound, and what had been lost in the first months of the year would be recouped in the months that followed. How wrong could we be? On the last day of February, Italy became the first European country to register 1,000 infections. France, Spain, Germany, and the USA followed within days of each other in the second week of March, and the United Kingdom followed a few days later. The disease spread over Western Europe, but more alarming was the rapid escalation in the number of cases. 8, 9, 10 days from the first 1,000 cases, and countries were facing over 10,000. And this despite stay-at-home orders and curbs on non-essential travel. By the end of the month, Spain, Italy, and the United States had all surpassed 100,000 infections and were still waiting for the angel of death to cut a swathe through their already overstretched intensive care wards. It's difficult to foresee the impact that the coronavirus might have on the social, political, and economic structures of the world, and how far its citizens will lay their losses and their grief at the doors of their leaders. The future of international shipping may be the least of these concerns, but it too will be affected. For many branches of the industry, 2019 had been a promising year as the sector began to shake off the capacity overhang that had appeared after the 2008 financial crisis and subsequent depression. Let's start with container traffic. Containers usually carry relatively high-value semi-manufactured components and finished consumer goods. They account for less than a quarter of the world's seaborne cargo by volume, but almost 70% of it by value. The graphs show a composite index of freight rates on routes from China in general and Shanghai in particular. The latter is based on a more limited sample, but has a higher concentration of long-distance routes, but the trends are basically similar. The graphs show all of 2019 and the first 3 months of 2020. Now, given the uncertainty through which the world has been passing, the pattern is remarkably familiar. There's usually a spike in prices in the run-up to the Chinese spring holiday, followed by a return to normal by the start of spring. The only exception this year is that the new plateau reached is significantly higher than last year's. That's rather paradoxical. There are several explanations. The first is that as long as the virus was seen as a purely Asian phenomenon, there was every expectation that there would be a bounce back in deliveries in the second quarter. It reflected the extent to which the crisis in Europe and America had yet to be factored into future rates. The second case is the spectacular fall in the price of oil following the collapse of the Saudi-Russian agreement over oil production. Now, oil is a major shipping cost. At the start of March, OPEC oil was trading at $50 a barrel. 2 weeks later, the price had fallen to $30, and by the 1st of April, it had fallen to under $17. But there are no good times ahead for container shipping. Year-on-year demand for Europe-Asia trade for the second quarter of 2020 is slated to fall by 17%. Already, ship owners are blanking sales from Asia. In other words, they are cancelling scheduled routes, often without notice, and more is yet to come. The dry bulk sector carries low-value dry raw materials. It accounts for half of the trade volumes carried, and half of that is made up of just two commodities, coal and iron ore. Much of this trade is destined for Asia. The index that you see is the so-called Baltic Dry Index. This is a composite index measuring the price of moving different dry commodities by sea. Like container traffic, this sector too was steadily improving its position from the disastrous all-time low point on the 4th of January 2016, when the index hit 150. By August last year, the index had reached 2,440, its highest point in almost 9 years. The collapse since then has been as brutal as it has been precipitous. The demand for iron is predicated on continued demand for infrastructural projects, whilst coal is shared by iron and steel furnaces and coal-fired power stations. Expectations in that direction are clearly not very high. The index finished at the end of March on 634. Now, of all the sectors in shipping, the real roller coaster has been the market for oil tankers. The graph you can see has been prepared by the Baltic and International Maritime Council, BIMCO, whose regular publications, by the way, are a valuable source for anyone following developments in international shipping. It shows three sizes of tankers. VLCC are very large crude carriers capable of carrying 200 to 400,000 tons. Suezmax, which are ships capable of passing through the Suez Canal and typically carry around 160,000 tons, and Aframax are smaller vessels, usually less than 120,000 tons capacity. Now, as with the rest of the industry, the sector had also seen improved performance in 2019. Then in October 2019, you can see a sharp spike in freight rates. This is the result of the imposition of sanctions by the United States on oil tankers that had been seen to violate its bans on trade with Iran and Venezuela. Now, these sanctions had the effect of removing 300 oil tankers from the market. This produced a scramble then for the rest of the existing capacity. Now, the rates usually fall off at the start of the year. The spike in October actually accentuates this trend. But then in February 2020, there's an unusually sharp collapse. Now, this is only partly a reaction to the anticipated fall of demand. Stocks levels remain high because of the slowdown in economic activity in Asia. But it's also a reaction to the removal of earlier sanctions on Chinese tankers, thus restoring capacity to a market that was already glutted, a sort of reverse spike. Then, in the middle of all this doom and gloom, there's a sudden renewed upward spike in March. Where does this come from? Well, that's a reaction to a sudden availability of ultra-cheap oil, which, by the way, nobody believes is going to last, and there's nowhere to store it. Suddenly, oil tankers cease to be a means of transport and are wanted as a vehicle for storage. By way of illustration, on the 17th of March, one of the world's two largest oil tankers, the TI Europe, capable of holding 3.1 million barrels of oil, has been chartered for 6 months at $37,000 a day to be used for oil storage. You do the maths. Before leaving, I want to stop at one further development. January the 1st, 2020 actually marks an important milestone in maritime history. It's the day when ships had to cut emissions of sulfur dioxide into the atmosphere by a factor of 7. Now, this could have been done by one of two ways, either by switching to low sulfur fuels, which carried a premium in price compared to heavy sulfur fuels, or by installing so-called scrubbers, which had the effect of removing sulfur during the voyage. Now, one impact of recent developments has been to shift the choice in favor of the former, since the price differential between the two fuels is much lower. And because, in anticipation of lower activity and cash flow problems in the future, ship owners are deferring decisions to retrofit scrubbers onto their ships, since this can cost up to about $2 million each, and they're even cancelling existing orders. Now, how all of these trends play out will be the subject of the next update in 3 months' time. I hope that you've enjoyed this video. The music, by the way, was composed by Janet Zaddo, leader of the Florence Youth Orchestra in Italy. Details of how to reach us will be on the following slide, and I look forward to meeting you all online again sometime soon. Goodbye.